So good morning, everyone. We want to welcome you and thank you for joining us. We have several people that will be joining us on the call this morning. So on behalf of the Cheektowaga Chamber of Commerce, we want to welcome everyone that was able to hop on. This will be recorded, so if you're not able to hop on or need to access the content afterwards, this will be made available to each of you as well. We want to welcome and thank our Catalyst partners and members from the Bonadio group. So this morning we have joining us Dan Casilny, who's a partner and longtime member with the Cheektowaga Chamber of Commerce, and Stephen Turner, who is a principal in the commercial division and also a member of the internal task force that is working on navigating the COVID-19 government loan programs and specifically the PPP loan forgiveness, which is what we're all interested in talking about this morning. We've certainly received several questions and are eager to dive through and have a robust discussion on them. If you didn't get a chance to submit questions in advance, please feel free to utilize the question and answer feature in Zoom, and you can submit them that way. I know that there are many questions surrounding this. Some are more broad, some are very specific to your type of business. So if we are unable to get to every single question that's been submitted, please continue to submit them and reach out directly to me at the chamber, and I will be sure to get some answers for you. And with that, I'll kick it over to our team from the Bonadio group. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thanks, Christina. Morning, everyone. So as Christina mentioned, I know everyone's hungry for information on the PPP loan, and specifically what we're going to talk about this morning is more driven by the forgiveness process. So my game plan, and we're doing this live, my game plan is to spend maybe about half of our time together running through some background and walking you through some slides, and then spend the remainder of that time going over the questions that people have submitted already and taking some questions live. So that should be fun. All right, I'll get rolling here. All right. Okay, so I'm going to speak under the assumption that the majority of the people on this call today are beyond the process of what is the CARES Act, what is the PPP or Paycheck Protection Program, and give you some brief background on how we got here and where we're going from here more broadly. So PPP, Paycheck Protection Program loans, was a provision of the CARES Act signed into law on March 27th, 2020. So we're already 2 months in at this point to that post-CARES Act world. And it provided for loans to qualifying eligible companies in the amount of up to $10 million, or more commonly, the 2.5 times your average monthly payroll costs. And using payroll costs is a big bucket because for anyone that's started to deal with this, you realize that the definition's not always really clear. What's included, what's excluded isn't always really clear either. So after the application itself was really only about 2 pages, and what drives the loan amount that you may have received or the loan amount that you will be applying for, if you haven't already, you have until June 30th or until the money runs out. There are certain legal expenses that you can pay with these funds. And from this perspective, the use of proceeds, the proceeds can be used for payroll costs, which include benefits in this bucket of payroll costs, and I'll get into that a little more. Interest on mortgage obligations, and that has a specific definition to it as well as to what a mortgage obligation is. But the important piece here is that it has to be something that was in effect, that was legally in effect with a written agreement prior to February 15, 2020. You can pay rent on both real and personal property. So to clarify there, real property building, personal property, machinery, equipment, etc. Anything that you had a lease agreement in force prior to February 15th, and then utilities for which you began service prior to February 15th. So the overall idea here is that no new, this is meant to retain, not even really restore, but just keep the lights on, keep everyone at work, and keep the business operating in the post-COVID-19 world. So that's the thinking on this February 15th piece here. Okay, so utilities, I'll go into that a little more later, but utilities has evolved to have a more solid definition there too. So this chart, I'm not going to go line by line on this, and I'd be happy to share any of these slides if anyone requests them after the fact, but the big piece here that I wanted to point out is that there is a difference between acceptable use of the loan proceeds. So for example, on the left column here, the left side column, you can't take your PPP funds, and I know I saw some news stories about people using the funds for, I saw jewelry or cars, etc. Not allowed. You can only use the loan proceeds legally for everything in the left column. But the interesting piece and the nuanced piece here is that although this looks pretty similar, it doesn't match up one-to-one. So what you can legally use it for doesn't mean that that is a forgivable expense. And the goal here, I think for most business owners, I'd imagine, is to, if you need this loan, it's probably best going to benefit you to have as much of it forgiven as you're able. Okay, well, so let's start talking background on forgiveness here. And sorry that I'm looking to the left. I have this shared on my other monitor here. So an eligible recipient can be eligible for forgiveness of this loan in an amount equal to the sum of the following costs that I'm going to run through, incurred and payments made during this covered period. So jump around a little on this, but let's go back and talk about the term covered period. So from the point that this act got signed into law on March 27th, and then that might have been I remember it being a Thursday or a Friday, but the process itself for the applications kind of went live almost a week later. And I'm sure as anyone on this call has experienced, individual experiences varied by bank, varied by bank size, varied by preparedness, both of the borrower and of the bank itself. So there were some banks that went live day one, and there were some banks that waited almost a week too to kind of get their own house in order before they started accepting applications. And when I go back to the application itself for a second here, like I said, 2 pages. And ultimately, what drives the amount that you got, 1 box. You didn't even, in many cases, always have to submit your full calculation of how did you end up with this number. And the interesting piece there is it is on you. It's on you as the borrower. So this act kind of removed any liability from the bank to verify any of this information. You, as a borrower, did your own calculation within the confines of the law. You filled in 1 box on here ultimately, and then a box for head count. And big question that's coming up right now is that head count isn't a one-to-one comparison, by the way, of what we're dealing with, what I'll talk about in a second, for head count pertinent to forgiveness, not the same calculation, which makes it even more confusing. So on the application, you had to have under fewer than 500 employees to be eligible for a PPP loan. And that includes some complex SBA affiliation rules in there too. So if you have related businesses, you may, in some of those cases, have to kind of group that together to determine if you're over the threshold or under the threshold of 500. So what else did you have to do? You had to make certifications, 8 certifications if I recall on there, and one kind of key one, and to give you the most bang for your buck in 30 minutes here, I would encourage all of you to either work with your CPA or advisor, if you haven't already, to make sure that you've documented your eligibility for this loan. You may have gone through the process quickly, received the money, and you may not have fully documented internally even your eligibility. There were parameters that spoke to need, which is vague. There were parameters that spoke to liquidity and access to capital, and another parameter in there that speaks to access to capital up to but not exceeding sort of thing, being detrimental to the business. If you have an existing $500,000 line of credit available to borrow on, chances are if you max that thing out to get through the COVID-19 crisis, you're not going to be in good shape. So you do qualify, or you should qualify. So there are some parameters there that you really need to make sure step by step that you've documented in. And the best case scenario, when I talk to people, I let them know. The best case scenario for this is usually the same best case scenario as your financial statement audit. It goes in a file, goes in a folder, and no one ever looks at it again. So you put all this work into kind of covering your butt for someone to hopefully never look at this thing again. But as the Secretary of the Treasury has already said, there is going to be continued scrutiny on this, and there is no set end date to when that scrutiny may or may not end, and to what degree audits may be required of that. And I think in a broad sense, the most difficult piece of dealing with the PPP program is the information has come out so piecemeal, often contradictory, and from different sources. There's not one website, one master document even that has provides you with your information. Even as it changes, it could be posted in the form of a frequently asked question. It could be posted in the format of interim regs as these go along. Many of the questions got clarification as a result of the SBA releasing the actual forgiveness application, which is so backwards. You borrowed money under certain parameters, you're waiting, and now you didn't even get clarification until you get the application to apply to have this forgiven. So it can be overwhelming. All right. Payroll costs, I'm gonna run through this as quick as I can here, because I think some of the questions that have been submitted touch on this a little too. But payroll costs calculated on the gross basis, meaning you're not subtracting employer withholding or anything like that. It's usually easiest to start if you have a payroll provider. It's usually easiest to start with that gross number, not the net number coming out of your account, and working up to this. Let's see, would include in that gross number, like normal, the employee's share of FICA and other income taxes. But important to note, it does not include the employer's share of payroll tax, which is above and beyond that, in the range of about 7% there on top. That's on you. You don't get to count that. Let's see here. Okay, so I'm actually going to mute Dan. Dan, if you can unmute yourself if you need to. I was just getting a little feedback from the speakers there. Payroll costs. Okay, so the big piece here is that there's a cap of $100,000 annualized. You can pay people over $100,000 annualized, but you can't have it be eligible for forgiveness. So it actually took until, this is a good example, it took until the forgiveness application going live to get clarification of, well, how do you calculate this thing? Obviously, maybe not obviously, but in most cases, someone's not going to earn $100,000 in an 8-week period. But in an 8-week period, what if you pay someone $3,000 in 1 week? If you multiply that times 52 weeks, that's over $100,000 annualized. What if you pay a bonus or something because someone in there? And long story short, on what has been 2 months of debating this, the forgiveness application specified, I want to say $15,385. It's in change, but we'll just call it $15,385. You can't pay anyone, or any amount that you pay someone over $15,385 during your covered period, which I didn't mention here is your 8 weeks following your loan disbursement date, or another alternative period, which I can touch on if people are interested in. But you can't pay anyone over that amount. And in that bucket goes wages. It goes wages including bonuses, hazard pay, anything that's salary. What doesn't get included in there is health and retirement benefits, which are eligible for forgiveness, but are on top of that $100,000 annualized amount. These are just a couple items expanding on the retirement side. So employer contributions for a defined benefit or defined contribution retirement plans, 401k or a pension plan. Group health care, including insurance premiums, and the state and local taxes assessed on the compensation of the employee. So as it says at the bottom here, these things are added on top of or after the $100,000 maximum salary limitation. Okay, so if I step back one more time here and collect my thoughts, let's put some numbers to this just to make it easier to understand. You as a company received a $500,000 Paycheck Protection Program loan. What would prevent you from receiving $500,000 worth of forgiveness on this amount? Two things, really. First and foremost is you can't have $5,000 forgiven if you don't spend the $500,000 on qualifying expenses during the covered period. So if you, let's take restaurants, a great example. Restaurants, still governmentally restricted in New York State here from reopening at full capacity. If you previously had 100 employees, you likely, even if you're doing takeout or something in the interim, you're going to have a hard time getting everyone back to work here. And if you can't get everyone back to work, then you're probably going to have a hard time paying what was based on your normal operations from a year ago. So first and foremost, your first limiting factor is, what did you actually spend on qualifying expenses? The second thing, and that's what this slide is talking about more, is you can be limited or your forgiveness can be reduction if you don't get your head count back to 100%. So there was a lot of not even confusion, it was just lack of clarity on this. We included Bonadio, we were taking a guess up until information got released with the forgiveness application. We were taking a guess as to, okay, how is a full-time equivalent employee, FTEE, defined? And the nice part is now with the forgiveness application, we've gotten clarity that a full-time equivalent employee is defined as someone who works 40 or more hours on average each week. So if I go back to me mentioning the second limiting factor, if you had 100 employees in this restaurant example, you would need to either get back to 100 full-time equivalent employee average during your 8-week period, measured against one of two different comparison periods. And as it's mentioned here, February 15, 2019 through June 30th, or January 1 through 2/29/20. And you would be allowed to pick the lesser of the two. So if you look back to those two measurement periods and you look at your average headcount during your covered period, that could be a reduction. If you were only able to get back, and if it looked like a kind of an exponential graph, and you said, okay, we got our money and the doors are allowed to slowly reopen and we're going to build back to 100 employees. Well, think about it. If you started from 0 or near 0 and you work your way back to 100, from an average basis, you're not going to hit that average. You're not going to make it. So they actually put in another piece here to kind of give you an out, which is super useful. And that was, no later than June 30th, 2020, the eligible employer has eliminated the reduction in the number of full-time equivalent employees. So like it says here, in other words, if your full-time equivalent employees on, as a snapshot, June 30th, 2020, meets February 15th, meets your February 15, 2020 headcount, you're in the clear. So your average could be half or 50 out of 100 employees. And you're like, not going to make it, not going to make it, not going to make it. But you're working to ramp this thing back up and achieve full headcount by June 30th. You're in the clear. Now, a couple intricacies with this. If you, in my 100 employee example, if you're working your way back up towards 100 and you make it to 95, so close, not close enough. It's an all or none. So there are some outs that were given and clarified recently, and I'd be happy to speak to those in a moment too. But the gist of this thing is, if you think about it in two bigger steps, what money did you get? What money did you spend? Did you spend all of it? And if you did spend all of it, did you get your headcount back to where it needs to be, based on a couple of these different parameters here? And if you can say, yes, I spent all of it on qualifying expenses, and yes, I got my headcount back to 100%, then you arguably should be eligible for full forgiveness.
Hey, Stephen, before you go on, could I chime in with a question? Just kind of around that whole scenario. I know a lot of our members have been concerned when there's still a degree of uncertainty. Western New York, we're moving through the phases. Ideally, we'll be, into phase 2, June 2nd. But have you heard any guidance or gotten any, questions from your clients as well on if we are not, if there's still a government regulation in place for, say, that restaurant or any business that's not able to open to full capacity by June 30th? Are there options for extensions or anything like that you've heard?
So I get to be the bad news guy. No, not at this time. So there's no other option for those businesses right now. It doesn't mean that there won't be.
Right.
There's extensive talk. There's extensive lobbying. Think about restaurants. Think about entertainment venues. Concerts, large gatherings, any place with a large gathering of individuals that's still, restricted. That's where you're seeing a lot of the lobbying. But at this time, there's no extension. There's no alternative. And restaurants that's the crux of this is, I don't think that it's tough to think of a more in-your-face example than restaurants of, well, yeah, obviously they have need because they're shut down. You can't go there. And obviously they would benefit from an extension, simply an extension to kind of more match the government's restrictions on this thing. But you have to remember too, you're talking about comparison of a federal program to state regulation too, which is tough. I go back and forth on, and this is my Steve Turner's opinion, not Bonadio's or anything too. But I don't know. There's a lot of power behind the lobbying on that sort of stuff right now. But as we get further along, I see it as a tougher change to make. So think about the very earliest appliers to the very earliest borrowers in the PPP program. They potentially could be hitting their the end of their 8-week covered period next week, end of next week, somewhere right in that range. To me, it's tough to retroactively put that stuff into place if you have a business who's made decisions to spend this money down in a way that you may not have spent it down otherwise in the time period. You may have not rushed, but you may have been more heavy-handed, and it's in the spirit of the law. The spirit of the law was to keep people at work, put people back to work off of unemployment. But you may have worked harder to return people to work than you would have if you knew you had an extension and you could kind of take your time to plan. So that's a good question. It's a tough situation, and you know, as with so much of this, there's your vague non-answer. So yeah. It's that's where we're at right now with that. And then I forgot to give you reminded me of a good point. I forgot to say this at the beginning of starting to speak today, but so much of this information, it's still at an interpretation stage, and so much of this information continues to change. So please don't you know, take something that I've said back with 100% authority. The bank doesn't care what I say. The bank is the one that's going to manage your forgiveness process. They're the ones that are going to take all your documentation and your calculation. Can someone like me or Bonadio help you? Absolutely. And when you look at the overwhelming amount of information, it's I think that an advisor could really help you in a situation like this. But it's tough. I think the example that I use when I speak with companies is I kind of think about it like playing chess, where you know some of the rules and you're like, I'm kind of vague on some of this other stuff. So I'm just going to position all these pieces as best I can with the information that I have at this time. And that's really all you can do here, is you can make decisions, business decisions, to spend this money in a manner that best matches up with your goals as a business and the forgiveness rules as interpreted at the time that you're making these decisions. So it's enough soapboxing on that for now, I guess. But okay, so other component here. So I talked about $100,000, can't go over that. I talked about headcount. Let's touch on something else that could reduce your loan. You cannot, for anyone who's making an annualized rate of pay less than $100,000, you have to look at and report on and monitor for reduction if you have reduced their pay more than 25%. So let's think about some interesting scenarios here for this. Let's take an hourly employee. So hourly employees, this parameter matches up only to their hourly rate of pay, not their hours. So if times are tough. If you had someone making $16 an hour and you dropped them to $11 an hour, it's greater than 25%. If you drop them to $12 an hour, technically not a reduction, it's not more than 25%. Let's say you kept them at $16 an hour, but you had to cut their hours from 40 to 30. First and foremost, they'd be eligible for partial unemployment with the federal bonus on there too. Secondly, even though you reduce their hours for an hourly employee doesn't count, only the hourly wage. So let's take another scenario. Think about maybe a car dealership. So car dealership that has salespeople. And this car dealership is shut down like all of them. They're restricted to internet sales. So you have salespeople that you want to bring back, you need to bring back and start paying them in order to get your headcount up to be eligible for forgiveness for the rest of your spend. You probably don't want to pay a salesperson their full wages with commission and everything if they're not selling cars. So interesting out for that one as an example is if you look at someone's pay during 2019 and in any of those pay periods, so if we take, pop my calculator up over here and do this, $100,000 divided by 52 weeks, it's $1,923 per week. Technically, if they received a bonus or a commission or whatever, and they exceeded 1923 in 1 week in the prior year, they're out of this measurement category. They have an annualized rate of pay in excess of 100,000. So there are a ton of intricacies with this piece, but it's something that everyone needs to monitor. This is just more talking about the reduction in pay that I mentioned. Okay, so here's one thing that is pertinent to a lot of different employers that I want to touch on. So before, when I was using my made-up example of 100 employees getting back to 95, you may still have an out, is the long story short. So let's take all the business owners on the call. You're operating in an environment of enhanced unemployment benefits, which can be a tough sell to get people to come back to work if they're collecting in New York State in the range of $1,100 a week. Oftentimes, that's in excess of what they would be making back at their hourly position. So what can you do? And this is kind of a double-edged sword here, so I'll mention this too. If you offer this employee back their position, same hours, same pay, and you get a written denial, you can technically count that in your head count. So if you had 100 employees, you got back to 95, but 5 people either said, Steve, I'm not coming back. I'm not coming back to work, written decline, or reduction in hours. If I was working 40 hours and I'm like, listen, schools are closed, what do you want me to do? I can only cover 20 hours. You can count that person. You could count the 40-hour employee who dropped to 20 at 40. So it helps your head count. So it uses the phrase de minimis, and the fun part with so many other areas of this program, it doesn't define de minimis. So no, no one can give you a number as to how many employees you can have turned down a job, but with every step of this program in starting from eligibility, documentation is key. So start with your documentation and work your way back in there. So forgiveness, the forgiveness process. If you haven't looked at the forgiveness application, go to Google, type SBA PPP forgiveness application. It's a lot more pages than the application, so unfortunately it's not going to be quite that easy. But make yourself familiar. And I say this, even if you're working with an advisor like the Bonadio group to help you manage your forgiveness process, become familiar with this. There are some really important definitions that are clarified in here, and I think it will give you, as a business owner, a better understanding of managing this program on the business operations side of things. So how will this work? You'll have to say, so one thing I didn't mention here too is a threshold was put in. If you received over $2 million, you are going to be subject to audit, but I don't know what audit means. Someone's going to be poking around in your documentation. If you're under, you're safe harbored. You're actually safe harbored for the purposes of eligibility, and it looks like you won't be audited for this. Doesn't mean that you don't need the support, doesn't mean that you don't need to submit the support, just means that won't be audited. And I don't know what audited means as far as in-depthness or the in-depth range of that. So you'll have to submit documents, you'll have to make certifications, you will have to work with your bank, your lender, to see what the timing is. The big question I'm getting right now is, when do I apply? My answer is, I don't know. Some of the larger banks, if you think about the huge influx of applications that they received, they are going to have a similar influx of forgiveness applications, and the forgiveness applications are exceedingly more complicated than the borrowing application. So we've seen instances where some of these bigger banks are going to maybe assign you a number. You were week one application, you're week one when we open the window for forgiveness, or your loan ends in 1, 2, 3. Loans ending in 1, 2, 3 fall in this week to apply. So make sure that you are contemporaneously retaining, maintaining, and organizing your documents that support your calculation for forgiveness. Once the lender receives everything, they must make a decision on forgiveness within 60 days. One other cool piece about this is there may be incentive to drag this out. And what does that look like? Why do I say that? So from the moment that the CARES Act was signed, March 27th, until you receive a decision from your lender on forgiveness, every company, regardless of if you utilize the PPP or not, is eligible to be deferring employer-side Social Security, which is 6.2% of payroll. And you defer this, and it's all done through your payroll tax returns. You defer this amount, and you pay 50% of this amount that you're deferring in this time period at the end of 2021, 50% at the end of 2022. So there's a play here to even open up some more cash flow. All right, so I went a little over my 30 minutes here that I wanted to go through here. I'm gonna stop sharing. And I know, as I close this, I know that we've received a bunch of questions. So Christina, I'm going to pop over to your email.
Sure.
And
we can kind of tackle a few as they go too. I know we've received some in the both the chat and the Q&A, and I think a lot of them we're going to see many similarities that are kind of transcendent across, you know, a lot of what many employers are dealing with. So some of the ones that came in through the chat, I don't know if you can see it on your end, but our restaurant converted to takeout and delivery, applied for the loan in case they were closed. So is there, basically here, is there any ramifications? Will they still qualify for forgiveness even though they've been able to maintain cash flow and still make enough money basically to cover the costs?
Sure. So an important way to think about this, and this is not just, and I do see Mary's question on here, the important way to think about this: you are eligible for forgiveness if you spent the money on the qualifying expenses in the time period and you hit your head count. Your question, and this is an answer to a broader group here too, is really kind of more along the lines of, am I eligible for the PPP? And this goes back to maintaining your documentation of eligibility. Uncertainty, I don't know if I said that. I didn't say that word originally, but that was the other word I was thinking of. Need, uncertainty, liquidity, those three things. So uncertainty, let's talk about, you know, the question begins, our restaurant. So restaurant industry, apply this to anything. At the time of application, at the time of CARES Act, at the beginning of COVID-19 shutdown, I don't think that anyone, first of all, I didn't think I'd be sitting here giving this presentation from my office at home at this time. I know that many of the businesses, from a restaurant perspective, you had no idea if you were going to be shut down for a week, a month, a year. You had no idea if you'd be able to successfully convert to takeout and delivery. And you probably had no idea at that time if you'd be able to retain all your employees or keep your payroll the same. To me, that sounds like uncertainty. Need. Restaurants especially. Restaurants are a cash flow business. Oftentimes you're using today's cash that came in to pay yesterday's expenses. And to me, that speaks to liquidity. And granted, I'm speaking broadly, but your mileage may vary. But I would tell you, as long as you've documented all that, that's kind of a separate question, a separate situation from the question that you have on here about, look, we were actually able to keep all of our employees employed through this time period. Our payroll never dipped. Doesn't matter. You're good. So you're good for forgiveness side of things. Where you need to focus your efforts is, in my opinion, on the eligibility side of things. So hopefully that answers that. I'll click off this next question on here real quick too that just popped into the chat. Can I address can everyone see these questions, Christina, or is it just me?
No, I believe in the chat, everyone, all attendees should be able to do those as well. And this one in particular, cool. I think a lot goes into that as far as the 75% and looking at bonuses. I know that was in one of the questions that we received in advance as well, and how that applies to the 75%.
Sure. So let me answer this. This last chat question says, can you address the 75% of payroll costs needed to have loan forgiveness? Yes, I can. So the limiting factor, and the best way to view this is, I think, top down. So I always try to think about this as, okay, you received your $500,000. What's your first limiting factor? First limiting factor is spend. What I didn't go into when I was rushing through those slides is the 75%. So the 75% is going to be a restrictor. So it's a requirement that of your spend, 75% of your spend is made on payroll. What's in the payroll bucket? Payroll actually means payroll and benefits for this purpose. So group health, group retirement, and wages with the corresponding employer side, state taxes, that sort of thing there. So let's say you were able to spend $500,000 of $500,000, but you really just ended up spending, let's say $300,000 of it on payroll and benefits. How would this work? You spent 500 grand, but you're going to be limited. So if the easiest way to do this is, in this example, if you take in a calculator $300,000 divided by a max of 0.75, because that's where you need to be, or I'm sorry, a minimum rather of 0.75, gives you 400 grand. So $400,000 would be your maximum loan forgiveness because you were only able to spend 300,000 of it on payroll and benefits. So in the $500,000 example, and you can ratchet that down appropriately. Let's say you only spend 150,000 of your 500, and 100 grand of it is on payroll. 100 grand divided by 0.75, your max forgiveness, 133 grand. You can spend 100% on payroll and benefits, but you have to spend a floor of 75% of it, and that's going to be your restricting factor there. Let's talk about bonuses in this calculation. Hazard pay, bonuses. wage increases, whatever. Yes, yes, yes. All eligible to be included in this bucket with the cap of $15,385. So if you have someone making $1,500 a week, and I'm overly simplifying. There are actually some big complexities in here where you could potentially be looking at up to 9 or 10 weeks of payroll expense here, but I'm not going to go into it in just a webinar here. But work with your advisor if you have questions on that. So $1,500 times 8 weeks, 12 grand. So that means 12 grand minus 15,385. You got 3,385 of wiggle room to give this fake employee hazard pay bonus, whatever. So if you were to say, okay, you've been doing a great job and here's 5 grand. Well, you can do it, but it's not going to be eligible for forgiveness for part of that. So hopefully that kind of answers that question.
Hey, Steve?
Yes.
Before we move on, I just want to make a point here that is, and the other things you point out with the slides, is a very good reason that you should be looking at this before your 8-week period is up. There may be some things you can do to achieve something closer to the 75% or avoid reductions along the way for the amount of payroll or the head count. A lot of clients of mine are asking, I'd like to bring back an employee, but he or she, there's not enough work for that employee right now. You want to run that through your calculations. It may help you to bring that employee back in terms of loan forgiveness, that you can justify the fact that that employee may not have a full workload. So that's something you got to look at, I think, along the way, and certainly before the 8-week period is up. And Steve, if you wouldn't mind, could you hopefully quickly, but the income tax portion of the forgiveness, I know it's not directly the forgiveness issue, but that is another thing that people should be recognizing, is that in the loan forgiveness, there's ultimately going to be an income tax issue along the way.
In terms of, are you talking about to the business itself?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I can touch on that. So guidance where it stands today indicates that the forgiveness, the amount that you receive, and when we're talking about forgiveness, it's forgiveness of debt. Remember that what you took out, it's a loan. It's a loan right now, and it's a 2-year loan, deferred for 6 months, paid over the remaining 18 months. 2 years, 1%. And I would caution you because some of the complexities that you're going to get into here are, like Dan mentioned, okay, do I bring this person back? Or do we say, look, it's not going to give us benefit. We're not going to get benefit from this. And instead, we're going to go a different route. Instead of trying to put everyone back on and get my head count up, spend my 500 grand, I'm going to pull back on the reins here and I'm going to spend half. And I know I'm only going to maybe get half of this thing forgiven, and the rest is going to be a loan. Just remember that your agreement is a loan agreement, and it should indicate what your payments are going to be during this 2-year period. So if you were going into this and you're like, 500 grand, okay, no big deal. I'm gonna get 500 grand forgiven, and then the world happened and everything changed, and now you're staring down the barrel of a remaining loan amount. You have to pay that loan. And side note on that, oftentimes what we're seeing is think about 500 grand amortized over 18 payments. It's almost $28,000 a month. Even if you get the majority of this thing forgiven, pending what your individual loan agreement states, it may not re-amortize. So if you're like, well, I only have 100 grand left divided by 18, that's not too bad of a payment. You may be looking at the original payment, which could be crushing from a cash flow perspective. So keep an eye on that,
And
on that piece there.
Stephen, on that end too, that kind of correlates to one of the questions that was popped into the Q&A box as it relates to a phase 4 employer. So maybe a gathering place or anyone that would fall in that phase 4 who received PPP, but say they can't use it. Can they just treat that as a low interest loan to repay?
You can do that. I would, these are disappearing on here, but yeah, so you can, short answer on here. I think Christina, you were cleaning house on these Q&A questions. Sure, it's still a loan. Keep in mind that you may have, you're too late on the EIDL loans, the economic injury disaster loan, but it's a pretty low interest rate environment now anyway. It's not a 1% low, but you're still 2 years is a short amortization to get everything together to be able to recover from this thing. I'll answer this other Q&A here. I'm just going to cough on mute. Okay. Can you pay an employee much more than before to make their weekly pay close to the unemployment benefits to make it more attractive to return? Yes. Yes, you can. You can increase pay up to the overall cap during the covered period of $15,385.
So that's an opportunity then for, any of those employees that it's that additional federal $600 on unemployment is kind of proving to be a disincentive to bring those folks back. So that's an eligible expense then.
Small businesses are hurting as a result of that. And look, I think there's value here. No one chose to not have a job as a result of COVID-19. And I have zero political commentary on that at all, because I think every situation is different. But the reality of it from a business perspective is it can be tough. So just remember that you do also have that de minimis policy, but the thing I didn't mention when I was talking about it, as far as offering someone their job back and having them decline, there is reporting, there is corresponding reporting. So the reality of it is, regardless of what the reason is that they don't want to come back, they are probably not unemployment eligible as a result of that too. So yes, Milton, who asked the question, you can increase pay. I'm gonna try to clip off a couple of these other ones on here too. So someone asked a question about new rule just came out for wages for owner employees. I am not going to speak to that on here other than to tell you that the rules vary by business structure, so it's just too tough for me to answer it in a group setting. But keep an eye out if you are, when people are saying owner employee, it's tough for me to know if you're talking about an LLC or someone who files a Schedule C on their personal income tax return. But there are restrictions, so you can't, you're limited to last year's average net income, monthly average net income from your Schedule C. You can't say, well, oh, I was making $2,000 a month net on my Schedule C as an owner employee, and now I'm going to bump this thing up. But there's too much complexity for me to answer that in a group setting. Sorry to whoever asked that one there. Date range when the low. Yep, go ahead.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, I was just going to say we've got about 5 minutes left, so we can tick off a few more. And specifically this next one regarding date range, we also received one in advance that kind of goes hand in hand with this in terms of the date range and when the PPP was funded versus when the qualified expenses can take place. So the one that we had received in advance, the question was around if the company was funded, say, April 22nd, could they utilize the PPP funds to pay qualified expenses, rent, payroll that were already paid during that month? So say their rent was due, I don't know, April 1st. They didn't receive PPP until later that month. Can they still kind of reimburse themselves for that payment?
So let me hit both of those. So as far as what the date range, so I'll do it in reverse order. So no, if you already paid it, you can't go back and count it. If you needed to catch up rent and you paid it during the covered period, further clarification has said yes, that's allowed. Likely. Can you prepay rent in advance? I would say that's a super aggressive position and probably not, although there's lack of clarity there too. As far as what the range is, what the date range is, your covered period range begins, your 8 weeks begins on the date that you receive the money in your account. You can only count, without me going in depth on this, incurred or paid during that time frame. So how does June 30th interplay into that? June 30th is a snapshot date for headcount only. It's a standalone date, doesn't move, even if it's inside or outside of your range. You can apply for this loan as it stands right now up to June 30th. June 30th is still the date. So just remember that those two are not the same. The forgiveness application, and I know I had a question on here too from someone that said what documents will be needed to accompany the forgiveness application. Look at the application. There's a ton of stuff on there that needs to accompany it, payroll reports, etc., substantiation. What was I going to say? The time frame of this thing, what will accompany? I think that's it. But your 8 weeks starts when you receive the money. There is also an option now, as of a week ago, that you can use what's called an alternative payroll period. And there's some complexity to it, but we'll just say that instead of, let's say you receive your money on April 22nd, and it's right in the middle of a payroll period that you have, you can technically get this thing started at the beginning of your next payroll period. And this is what I was mentioning on the phone. There's some strategy here to potentially being able to use 9 or 10 weeks, depending on your rate, when your pays happen in there. What else can I hit on here, Christina, to give some value?
There was a good one that we've gotten in a few different scenarios, but how long is a company required to keep employees? So after that June 30th, you've maintained your head count. Is there any kind of date or metric that they're using? How long you have to keep that head count in order to maintain forgiveness?
Not at this time.
Okay.
Not at this time. Anything else in this Q&A? And I don't know if this will stay open for 5 extra minutes, but I'd be happy to stay on for an extra 5 minutes just to click through a couple of these if we want.
That sounds great. And you know what, for anyone that does have to jump off as we're nearing 10, we'll be, or 11, I don't even know what day it is anymore these days, but we will make available the entire recording on the Chamber's website at cheektowaga.org, as well as the SBA application for forgiveness. If you haven't already had a chance to view that, we'll put that document on the Chamber's site, and we'll follow up with an email as well, just for any questions that we may not be able to get to. But I'm happy to stay an extra 5 minutes or so as well. This is great. Thank you.
Okay. Rebecca asked a question. She's persistent. It's in the Q&A and in the chat. Tough question here. Let's see. Employees are paid weekly for manufacturing and biweekly for admin. Both cases, the hours are accumulated a week, and for admin, up to 2 weeks prior to actually paying them. Incurred as worked was causing an issue for incurred and paid. Incurred and paid is no longer a thing. So it was a thing up until, surprise, the forgiveness application made it not a thing anymore. So it's really more along the lines of incurred or paid. So if you think about you're incurring this expense as your employees work, you're paying it when your pay date is on this check. So you technically can, and this is contact your advisor for more details on this, but you can technically start your alternative payroll covered period at the beginning of your first full pay cycle. Incur for a week or 2 weeks in your example, Rebecca, and then pay it maybe 10 days later or 17 days later, I guess, technically, you obviously will have incurred a week or 2 weeks of payroll at the very end of your covered period that you haven't paid. So you can technically, possibly pick up a paid in the beginning and some incurred at the end to be over the 8-week period. Might be super helpful. That's kind of like a little more advanced strategy on that though. Exactly what taxes do you need to subtract from the gross wages to determine what is covered? You don't, if we're talking about gross wages. So just keep in mind that the way that wages are structured, you as an employee are earning, you earn gross pay. So let's make it as simple as possible. 40 hours a week, 10 hours, or $10 per hour, $400. Your withholding, state and federal, your FICA, Social Security, those are all withholdings from you as an individual. They're not business. The business paid you $400 of gross wages. What's not included in there and not covered is, as an employer, you pay an employer portion of Social Security, 6.2%, I think. And that portion is not allowable. So you're still on the hook for a piece that's not eligible for forgiveness on there too. What else did I miss on here, Christina? Is there any?
There was one other one from a question that was submitted in advance, but I believe we've answered it, but just to confirm, so there's no more lingering questions. So does an employer have to hire back the same employee? So even if they've gone forward, are they required to make a good faith written offer of employment to that particular employee, or is it strictly just maintaining the headcount?
Nope. It can work for you, but it doesn't work against you. What I mean by that is you don't have to offer or hire that same exact body, that same individual. But if you, alternatively, if you made an offer to that person and you received a written decline for it, that would count towards your headcount still. So I think that answers that.
So would you encourage or recommend that businesses that were PPP recipients are proactive in getting a hold of the application, gathering their documentation? Should they be reaching out to their lender or kind of wait to hear? What would you recommend?
You can certainly, so two things. One, towards the beginning of the presentation, you become familiar with that forgiveness application. It's going to answer a lot of your questions. It's going to confuse the hell out of you too, and I say that as me too, and I've been spending a ton of time with it. It's not the absolute easiest thing to go through line by line on there, but it'll give you good insight. I think the big piece is my messaging is communication, super important. Will your lender give you an answer or have an answer for you? Oftentimes no, because they don't have it yet. But there's nothing wrong with you contacting and saying, hey, do you have an idea of how you're going to handle forgiveness, queuing up for forgiveness, anything like that? And then the big thing too is there's shameless self-promotion here, I guess, but there's a ton of opportunity here for people to, if you don't wait too long, I or the equivalent, me or Bonadio, can probably help and direct you to maximize this thing. But if you come to me on week 7 of 8, I can't really do a whole lot for you. I can help you mine for like expenses that you might have missed or like things you included erroneously, but I can't strategize with you. And that's a big piece. And that's where a lot of these questions that are coming in, they're strategy questions, business operation questions. So I would encourage you to reach out, and if you don't feel confident in what you're doing, I think in many cases you can go from like a full outsourcing of this process to like spend some money, spend some time with an advisor to give you the personalized crash course of what you can do here. Any other questions, Christina, that I can hit to help the group?
There's one additional that popped up, but I think it's very specific. So maybe that's something that we can circle back on separately offline. But other than that, yeah, I think, we certainly understand how fluid of a situation this was, and that there were going to be a lot of things that needed to be worked out as people are navigating through it, just because of the nature of the situation. So we'll continue to do our best to provide members and members of the business community with updated information as we all are getting it. And we certainly appreciate the opportunity to have the conversation and share the information that you did this morning. That's the value, I think, of chambers of commerce, that we are able to convene resources and connect like this with people that have very specific insight. And I know that you're both working in this, in all of this daily, which I'm sure can be overwhelming as well. So I appreciate you taking the time to share your insight with our members and participants this morning.
Thank you for having us. Our pleasure.
Thank you. And just following up, for anyone left on the call, we are going to continue to answer questions. So we'll sign off the webinar, but feel free to share. All of my contact information will be in the emails. You can connect with us there, and we'll continue to help get those questions answered to the best of our ability. So we appreciate everyone that was able to join us, and I hope everyone stays safe and well, and we'll talk to you all soon. Thank you so much.
Great. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye now.